Hello, welcome to a video lecture I've put together for you on introductions and conclusions, and also the use of narrative in academic writing. So the assignment that we're working on right now, my multimodal memory, is predominantly using narrative throughout, about 2/3 or 3/4 of the essay, and then we have the reflection, the significance at the end. So this is a personal narrative essay, heavily dependent on narrative, but a lot of times people will say that, gee, I learned to write a personal narrative in my first year writing class, and I never wrote narrative in college again after that. But I would argue that narrative can be used to enliven academic writing, and so I see this sometimes in my discipline and journal articles and chapters where the writer will kind of start from the personal and then move outward from that. So they talk about their own experience, and sometimes then they use their experience as kind of an exemplar of experiences. And I think we see this with our next assignment where there's an essay, a profile essay about a guy who walks like 20 miles back and forth to work each day. And so his is a personal story, but it's also an exemplar of a situation happening in Detroit where public transit has broken down. I think also some of the sample essays that go along with this essay, the one about the woman whose brother was killed in Vietnam, that it's a personal story, but it's also kind of a commentary on something larger than. So personal narrative is frequently used that in that way. So she's kind of commenting on war in general. And in my field, oftentimes people will then branch a little more from that and talk about existing scholarship and positioning their experience within that existing scholarship, and then frequently coming back to the narrative at the end of the journal article or the chapter, and it kind of brings it full circle. So narrative should not be forgotten about after you leave the first year writing classroom, and there are different types of narrative that you can use. Also, in terms of introductions and conclusions, maybe up to this point you're used to a inverted pyramid kind of introduction that starts broadly and funnels down toward a thesis statement, and then a conclusion that kind of in reverse summarizes your argument or something, or the point you're trying to make. And we can do some things differently with introductions and conclusions with this essay. So some of it's going to feel a little bit more like creative writing to you, but hang with the process, and I think you'll get something out of it. So, okay, so moving on. In our text, the chapter on writing a narrative, we see a couple of prompts there at the beginning of that chapter. And one from Hofstra University, one from Hampton University. And so we get this, typical entry exam type writing prompt. Describe a meaningful event or experience and how it has changed or affected the person you are today. So, and the next one, describe a personal, moral, or ethical dilemma and how it impacted your life. So, somewhat different in that the first one is talking about an event, and the second one is talking about a moral or ethical dilemma, which is probably going to be an event. So, but we do have describe, and we have a two-part statement. There's the and how it has changed or affected the person you are today, or and how it has impacted your life. And so this is where we're turning the experience into meaning. So we're backing away from it. This is the reflection, the analysis at the end of the essay. And we do derive meaning from experience. So experience tends to be very specific, concrete, detailed, and that's kind of like your narrative. And then meaning, we extrapolate from that. And so it's kind of a process of deductive reasoning. As writers, we can actually turn this around And instead of leading our readers through a process of deductive reasoning, we can oftentimes take control of what we want them to know and then show evidence and then try to close the loop on that rhetorically. But I'm kind of getting off in another area there, so let me move along and try to stick to narrative. Okay, so use of narrative. Readers like stories. You introduce them to someone, they attach a face to a topic or an issue, and they want to find out what happens. So by putting a face on the issue, we are making an appeal to pathos. Pathos being one of the three rhetorical appeals: ethos, pathos, and logos. And pathos is also the most effective of the rhetorical appeals. And so we're making use of one of the most effective things that we can do as rhetoricians, telling a story, as writers. And so narrative is good. We get the reader involved with the story, and then we kind of move it more into a persuasive argument. So different types of narrative. Anecdotes are little self-contained stories, and so we're probably not going to use that in this essay, but in a as you move beyond this classroom, anecdotes, you could use those as a way to get into a complex issue. You tell a little story, typically it follows this when, and then something in the middle, and then now. And it becomes kind of an exemplar of what you're writing about in a larger sense. So sometimes people will put personal anecdotes into their research writing, sometimes in the middle. It doesn't have to be at the beginning. So case studies are also stories that result from clinical studies. Scenarios are hypothetical situations. So imagine this, or you go ahead and tell the story, and then you say, this story, while hypothetical, represents. So I don't think we'll be dealing with scenarios and case studies in this assignment, but narrative is used quite extensively. So we need to pay some attention to it. Okay, so we're going to be combining narrative in terms of written text and visual text. And so I'm going to ask you guys, I think sometime this week, to see if you can pull together some images that somehow tell a story by themselves. And what is that story? And we'll work that into the schedule and find a way to workshop those images. So in our text, they show the Michael Jackson glove, and then it has the year of his birth and the year of his death. And so they say that tells a story. So, okay. And in terms of writing a narrative, they talk about in the text, kind of the epistemological nature of writing narrative, that they enable us to make sense of our experiences. So we're actually kind of making meaning. We're engaging in a process of knowledge construction, so epistemology. So also illustrating a point, and then I emphasize making an argument or writing about the lives of others. So a personal narrative essay is a very subtle way of making an argument, making a reader kind of see things from your point of view. So there's a section in our chapter about narrative across cultures and communities. And so I just wanted to talk briefly about a couple of things. One is, you may have heard of this thing, the oral tradition. So before there was print, which led to the mass spread of texts, before that we had scribes, and books were not very common. And even before then, before there was any literacy at all, that there were stories, and stories would get handed down from generation to generation, and the story was important by itself as history, but even more so that it served as a framework upon which the storyteller could impart some wisdom, some values. There's a reason for the story, and so the narrative provides a structure to tell the story, and provides a structure, and then to impart the wisdom. So, and I think that sometimes we see this, in our tradition as well. So, okay. Characteristic features of personal narrative essays. This is in our text. Clearly identified event, a clearly described setting, vivid descriptive details, a consistent point of view, and a clear point. Why does the story matter? So some things about writing this narrative essay. One of them is in terms of pacing and timing, that as writers, believe it or not, we have the ability to control time. That we can take something like, people frequently write about sports events for this remembered event. Someone running for a touchdown, they're within the last 10 yards or maybe the last 5 yards, or someone shooting a basket as the buzzer goes off in basketball. We're used to this. We see it so much in movies, of this slow motion. And we can do that as writers. In our text, they have an excerpt from this article, Sports Perfect 0.4 Seconds. And that's an article about Steph Curry. And apparently that's about how quick his release is. So, but it takes like 3 really well-developed paragraphs to tell this 0.4 seconds. So obviously, we're slowing things down quite a bit, because it doesn't take us, we can't read 3 paragraphs in 0.4 seconds. So we've stretched things out and slowed things down for the reader. This adds dramatic emphasis in terms of speeding things up. As I mentioned here, we can say something like years later and get rid of a big chunk of time just like that. So writers can also kind of jump around in time. So sometimes when people tell this remembered events essay, there's too much chronos, too much of everything playing out in the same tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock manner. Sometimes they'll say, I'll never forget that day that changed my life forever. It all started when my alarm went off, and we have like 8 hours or 8 pages of narrative before we get to the big event that happened like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So start closer to the action. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. And vary the action. This creates dramatic tension and reader interest, keeps people involved. And so highlight the big points and stretch them out and minimize the other time. Okay. Let's see. A clear point, one of the characteristic features. I call it the big so what in this paper. So you've told a good story, so what? So, okay. So it says in our text, nothing irritates an audience more than reading or listening to a story that has no point. So when we get to that point in the essay, I think I've got a few more points on it here later in this presentation, but we need to work on what is the point. And a lot of times we're tempted to just slap something on the end, but I think that frequently a good reflection, significance, analysis section of this paper oftentimes takes 3 or 4 different writing sessions. So you kind of have to make a stab at it, go off and do something else, kind of turn it over to your subconscious, come back and spend 10 to 15 minutes working on it some more. Again, go off and do something else, maybe the next day, come back and work on it again because you're processing this experience. And this is the abstract thought part, so words are elusive at this point. And so it may take a while to kind of get things just as you want it. So, okay, moving on. Okay, so in terms of introductions and conclusions, that we oftentimes have this, standard introduction in our mind that we need to start broadly with something as a topic, and then it kind of funnels down. It narrows, focuses. In classical rhetoric, it's actually called definitio, as an issue, and then we might have a thesis statement, a main point. And so with a personal narrative essay, this might start off with, we all have many events in our lives that are really important to forming who we are as people, and then going into a rambling thing about several different events. And then but there was one event that really impacted my life. It's kind of your thesis. So this tends to be less interesting to your reader. So it's starting too broadly, and so we need to figure out ways to get around this. So one strategy that I want you to become familiar with is called in medias res, which means in the middle of things. And so if the introduction has, a door slammed, a shot rang out, a woman screamed or something, we're going to get pulled into that right away. So that's in the middle of things. And then oftentimes we'll take a paragraph after that, kind of after we get the reader involved with some action that kind of contextualizes what has just happened and the rest of the essay. So, another strategy is mise en scène, filling the scene. So instead of talking necessarily about what's going on, this is kind of describing the setting as vividly as possible, and then the action starts. So a framing device is something where we have something mentioned in the introduction. Maybe it's, like your narrative, and then we come back to it at the end. So this frames your essay, and it has a sense to the reader of coming full circle, and that is very satisfying to the reader. It kind of sends a message. Here's a writer who thought about what they were doing and knew what they were doing. They didn't just start writing until they ran out of steam. So you can use this framing device quite effectively. A takeoff on that I call a touchstone device, which is where something's mentioned in the beginning and then maybe 2 or 3 times after that, and then also again at the end. So we can keep coming back to it as a device in your essay. So there's my touchstone device. Use of quotes or epigraphs. So sometimes in between the title and the first paragraph, we'll kind of insert a quote up there at the top, italicize it, center it, that type of thing. So that can be effective. I wouldn't do that too often in your writing, but every now and then can be really effective. Use of questions. So sometimes we ask a question, then we spend the rest of the essay kind of answering it. I see that one that I may have left out of here is use of dialogue. So going along with in medias res, in the middle of things, is if you were to open your essay with some dialogue, dialogue helps to put you as the writer into that immediate situation. It also helps to put your reader into that immediate situation. So why not, use something like that to hook the reader and pull them in. Another thing, maybe not with this particular essay, but with other essays that you might write in your academic career, sometimes that inverted pyramid at the top, the introduction that starts broadly and funnels down and comes to a thesis, that oftentimes schematically I'll represent the structure of an essay with then a conclusion that's a right side up triangle, and those kind of mirror each other. And that's not an accident. So frequently, our introduction and conclusion kind of mirrors each other. And sometimes we say things better in our conclusion. So whether it applies to this particular situation, maybe not. But in some other writing situations, you can take your conclusion and move it to the introduction and see how it affects your essay. So sometimes we write our way toward what we're trying to say, and we say it best toward the end. So keep that in mind as well. Okay. And this part about throat clearing and warming up is sometimes we start too far back, kind of along with in medias res, starting in the middle of things. When you start too far back, sometimes we need to chop off the first 2 or 3 paragraphs on your essay. And sometimes student writers are horrified at this because they work so hard to get those 2 or 3 paragraphs. But my message to you is that those 2 or 3 paragraphs were not wasted if we cut them off. They help them to get you where you are in your essay. And so they fulfilled a useful purpose, but we could tighten up the essay and help the reader and make it more interesting if we kind of dispense with some of that throat clearing and warming up. So you have to kind of have an eye for seeing it in your writing, that, oh, what if I start with the second paragraph? What if I start with the third paragraph? So take a look a little bit further down and see if maybe you did engage in some throat clearing. Okay, moving along. I think we talked about these. Use of dictionary definitions. Basically, this becomes kind of cliche after a while. Webster's dictionary defines X as, and it gets overused. So, you might use it once a year in your writing, but don't do it any more than that. It really becomes cliche after a while. Okay. And I think we talked about those. So the importance of your conclusion. Let me go and get this next couple of things coming up here. Okay, so the reflection, the significance, the conclusion in your essay is your argument in your paper. This abstract thought, it's an argument. So the rest of it is talking about what happened. So it's the takeaway from your reader. It's the act of transference. It's the opportunity for them to take what you've done and apply it to their own lives. So that's kind of the point in telling some of this. It's abstract thinking, which we've talked about. With abstract thinking, words become elusive. And sometimes we have to kind of write our way around it. In other words, what I'm really trying to say is to put it yet another way. And so we oftentimes use those little sentence stems, those little markers, to kind of show the reader that we're struggling with this a bit and trying to get it all out and down on paper. Going hand in hand with that, oftentimes in a conclusion, something like this, personal narrative, we don't want to sound too smug and like we've got it all figured out. What I learned from this was X, but that we are kind of struggling to express ourselves. And so use of what are called modals and qualifiers, might, could, perhaps, other words like that, and use of the little sentence stems, like in other words, to put it yet another way. These show a writer thinking on paper, and that's very compelling to a reader. So don't act like you've got it all figured out when you get to this part of the essay, but instead explore it at length and allow a lot of that to stand. So there might be parts that you want to edit out, but if you're looking for that one succinct sentence that says it all, your reader's probably going to be disappointed. Another way of looking at the conclusion is by this point, you've invested a lot of time and effort in writing the narrative, the first part of the paper. So let's make the conclusion worthy of the time and effort that you've put into the first part of the paper. Another thing is, by this point, your reader has made an investment. And so we want to make this worth their time and effort in reading the essay. So I say down here at the bottom, may take 2 to 3 separate writing sessions, maybe 3 or 4. So keep processing that information and capture what you can on paper. So, okay, so I think we're moving along drafting wise, and I think we have a rough draft due at the end of this week. At this point, we're working on the written text on the page. I want you to start thinking about the mode of delivery, whether it's going to be an illustrated essay in Word or a PowerPoint presentation or a Prezi document. We're going to also look at some images before then. So see how images help you tell your story. So I think that's all I've got for now. Hope this has been helpful and worthwhile. And I'll be talking to you again soon. Thank you very much.